Good evening, everybody. We're taking a break from our Shemitah series, which most likely will return soon. But we're going to take a break for Inyana Diyoma, right? The matter of the day. The class is relevant to the Jewish calendar. Why? Because Purim is coming this very week, Wednesday evening. Very exciting. Woo! Purim, Puraya. Very exciting. So we're going to do a class to get us in the Purim spirit. We've already had a class about Little Purim, which is my favorite holiday. And we talked about actually how it was teaching us how to find joy in the everyday, because the secret of Little Purim is that there's nothing special about it. And it actually is trying to undo the notion that we need some special excuse to be able to find joy in our lives. But Purim is literally a holiday devoted to joy, so we will be focusing on its joyous nature. But specifically, we're going to look at the phrase VeNahafoch, which means, and it was reversed and it was overturned, which is a very striking phrase that you find in the beginning of chapter 9 of the Megillah. And then it gets repeated in a similar phraseology, but in a slightly different way, later on in the same chapter. The phrase captures the sudden reversal of fortune that the Jews find themselves in, just as they were supposed to be extinguished by the enemy, by Haman and his cronies, and the murderous Persians. Everything was reversed. The aggressors became the defenders. The seeming victors became the losers. Everything you thought shouldn't have happened happens. And it's that kind of radical transformation, the topsy-turvy nature of the day, the inside-outside, paradoxical quality of the day that we're going to be exploring this evening. So I'm going to share a screen and we're going to dive into the sources. All right, so let's begin with the source that I just mentioned. We'll look at this beginning of chapter 9 of Esther. It says, and so on the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, and as I think I said in the class recently, I said in Devar Torah recently in Shul, IRL, in real life. In the Bible, there are no names of the months. We only actually get the names of the months post-exile, and this is a good example of that because the Persian exile follows the Babylonian exile. It's only after we're exiled into Babylonia that we have now names for the months. So that's why Esther has to give a parenthetical. 12th month of the year. Oh, P.S. That's Adar. The day when the king's command and decree were to be executed, right? So Haman had, under counseling with Achashverosh, had installed a lottery, right? Purim, which means a lottery. They drew out the days where it was going to be the doom of the Jews. And which days are these? These are the 14th and 15th, the 13th of Adar. So when the king's command and decree were to be executed, the very day on which the enemies of the Jews had expected to get them in their power, the opposite happened. VeNahafoch, or the word hafuch. Essentially, I think it's the name of a kind of coffee drink in contemporary Hebrew. One that's got it's turned over or whatever. Point is, it was overturned, right? Hafoch means to overturn something, to reverse it. But in general, it means to transform something. So I want us to kind of focus on both the notion of nafoch, and it was transformed, but also the specific meaning of it, the literal meaning of it, and it was overturned. It was reversed. Okay, so we're going to kind of the more general notion of something being radically transformed, but also the specific dynamic of the reversing of polarity, right? Like making the bottom up and the up bottom, the inside outside and the outside inside, right? The reversal of the binary. And the Jews got their enemies in their power. Purim is really like a cathartic holiday, right? It involves, escaping from the clutches of defeat at the very last, escaping the snare of seeming defeat, and then turning it over, pushing back on the enemies. So it says, throughout the provinces of King Achashverosh, the Jews mustered in their cities to attack those who sought their hurt, and no one could withstand them. What I want us to focus on is the verse follows up in this notion of an overturn. To attack those who sought their hurt. Right, to reverse it back. It's like I'm rubber and you're glue. Right, whatever you're trying to do to me, it's going to get reversed and sent back to you. So the people who tried to hurt us, we ended up defeating them. Boom, overturn. And no one could withstand them, for the fear of them had fallen upon all the peoples. The people who were terrorizing us, right? We end up actually becoming a mighty power that ends up then making them quake in their boots. think some parts of Purim are kind of scandalous, especially for like a civilized age, right? Like, oh no, couldn't we have just forgiven them and shook hands? My mother, my sainted mother, um, uh, did not let me fight my Ninja Turtle action figures against the Bebop and Rocksteady. They weren't allowed to fight. I had to have a pizza party with them instead. My mom made a pizza out of like cardstock, and she said,
Excuse, excuse
"Excuse
me,
me,
quick,
you said
quick,
you were muting yourself."
quick interruption.
Oh no.
They fought, and then at the end, they
Oh,
all made up and had a pizza party. Okay, but
right. That's the nicer Book of Esther. I really mean it. I think like so. I think Purim is a challenging day. I think especially for like let's call it liberal Judaism. I mean that not in like contemporary political. I mean like liberal in the sense of like conflicts are resolved through like intellectual exchange, right? That things are resolved in the discursive sphere by talking things out. Um, Liberalism, right? Like I'm saying, like from the 18th century on, has always been uncomfortable with force, with power, with violence. So Purim is a day of reversal of power, of energy in that kind of right. Momentum gets pushed back on those. Now, I want to like like I say this a lot when I teach. I want us to try to open up our minds to experiment with this, not in the sense of like agreeing with like endorsing, let's say, the events that occurred. If like the martial victory that follows is distasteful to you, you have a right to that opinion, right? But point more is actually I want to experiment with this feeling of catharsis, of victory, one in which actually there's no little guilt inside, that you are able to release something, to celebrate, to expand in that kind of way. Um, all radical and revolutionary changes in society have to involve some kind of force, right? The people with property will not give it up, to the Jacobins in the French Revolution. It needed to be taken away, right? Like so. In some ways, there's a fantasy, right, of like we can all find agreement, but in a lot of ways, the fantasy of forcelessness ends up re-inscribing the status quo, and the problematic aspect of that is that the status quo itself is only defended with violence. Force is always present. The question then is who gets to use it and who's scared of whom. So what this is when the minority, the threatened, almost exterminated minority, is able to pick up arms, defend themselves, and put the oppressors back on their heel. And I want us to experiment with this idea. Okay, and indeed, all the officials of the provinces and satraps, which is a word that means like I guess the counselors, the city counselors, right? The premiers and the city counselors, the governors and the king's stewards showed deference to the Jews, right? Again, it's a fulfillment, right? It's a revenge fantasy. Like, all of these oppressors are now scared of us. Take that. Because the fear of Mordechai had fallen upon him. For Mordechai was now powerful in the royal palace, and his fame was spreading through all the provinces. All 11, all 7, how many provinces are there? How many provinces and so many territories? Mehodu viad Kush, right? From India all the way to Ethiopia, as it says. The man Mordechai was growing ever more powerful. So this really is like it is about embracing and expanding power. So the Jews struck at their enemies with the sword, slayed and destroyed them. They actualized their will upon their enemies. I actually slightly changed the translation there because the point here is that like much like experimenting with this notion of obtaining power, wielding power, gaining the upper hand. It is about having freedom, like to run rampant through society, to walk, and I think of it, I'll put it in interesting terms, maybe provocative terms. What would it take, right? Like, a contemporary issue that society, it's a shameful aspect of contemporary society that in the 21st century, 50% of the population don't feel comfortable walking alone at night. All right, that like women, what it means to have a status quo is that what is normalized is the threat and the potential violence against women. What would it look like for there to be a world in which women did not feel uncomfortable or worried walking alone at night? It would mean that there would be a change in the balance of power. So what it would take for that to occur would have to be, and we're seeing this in some kind of ways happen as society shifts, that people now have to be scared in different kinds of ways. That there is a shift of how fear is working. Right now, the status quo, again, in the status quo, violence and force are always made invisible. But that invisibilized violence and fear is that half the population are scared when it is absolutely unjust that they should be. And then the question is, how does that force or violence rebalance in a way that's more equitable? Hopefully towards a world in which no one's scared to walk around at night anymore. But the question is, how do you get there? So here what we have is the Jews walking around freely, not scared anymore that there's people who are around the corner who are going to hurt them. And what that took to do was to pick up arms, defend themselves, and to turn the tide. And it's revolutionary in that kind of way. What I want to focus on here is that the model of VeNahafoch, the reversal, the transformation, is one of the binary. We were on bottom, now we're on the top. It's the overturning. Right? The positions are identical. The question is who occupies them. There is a bottom and there's a top. There's a bottom and there's a top. Who's on the bottom and who's on top is the question. The reversal is that now this has occurred. People who were the victims are now the victors. People who were the aggressed upon are now the aggressors. Right? The oppressors are now the oppressed. Okay? So the terms of society, the hierarchy remains the same, but who occupies those positions in the hierarchy, that's different. Is that model of the reversal, is that clear? I want to kind of anticipate, we're going to look at another model, maybe a more far-reaching, a more radical model of what VeNahafoch can mean when we get to the second block of the Megillah. But I want to explore this one first. And I want to, again, I want to defend it in its way. Like, what it means is for there to be a real change in the political position of the Jews or any oppressed class, there needs to be some kind of change in the balance of power. And what that means is force needs to be applied in some way or another. And that's what this is. This is the dirty work of politics, the dirty work of liberation, in which those without power seize power for themselves. That's the reversal. Right, before we move into the commentary, what's your commentary? Do you have questions, insights? Okay. Get at me when things arise in your mind brain. Okay, so let's look at a medrash from the Tanchuma, a later midrashic collection. It says this: Haman wanted to destroy all of the Jews. We know this. But the Holy One, blessed be God, did not desire that. And therefore, VeNahafoch asher yishlatu Yehudim. It was turned over to the opposite. It was reversed. What the Jews... that the Jews ended up ruling over those who wanted to rule over them. Okay. So it's describing, it's expounding on this shift in the balance of power. That those who wanted to rule over us, we now rule over them. We defeat those who wanted to defeat us. We have freedom that they wanted to take away from us. Balaam and Balak wanted to curse Israel, but the Holy One did not agree, as it is said. Nevertheless, the Lord thy God will not listen, will not obey Balaam, will not hearken to Balaam. And it also is said, who is it that says, and it shall come to pass, that when the Lord says something, when God says something, that it won't come to be? Right? I.e., when God says something, it comes to be. So Hadrian, the Roman emperor, where we have like a running line of villains. We start with Haman. Boo. Then we go back in time to Balaam and Balak, right? The magician / prophet and the king who wanted to defeat the Jews. Then we zoom forward in time to the rabbinic period. Hadrian, the Roman emperor, right? The one who ends up destroying the temple in the year 70. Hadrianus. He said to Rabbi Joshua, Mighty is the lamb that can survive amongst 70 wolves. What does that mean? Remember, that's Hadrian, the Roman emperor, saying that to Rabbi Joshua. What does he mean?
That the Jews are pretty resilient, that they have people attacking them from all sides, and they still manage to endure.
Right. And in rabbinic literature, everyone's a rabbi. Like, why is it that Hadrian would know the 70 nations of the world, right, versus the nation of the Jews, right? So we're the lamb, Jews are the lamb, and the 70 wolves are the 70 nations, poised against us. So Hadrian accepts the terms, and he says that your position is one of resilience. You are resisting, you're withholding against the aggression of these mightier, more numerary foes. Right? There's more of them than you. They're stronger than you. They're carnivorous. You're a little baby lamb. But your might is in being able to overturn expectations, because a lamb, you wouldn't think a lamb could survive against 70 wolves. Booyah. But Rabbi Joshua, interestingly, that sounds like an endorsement of the Jews, right? Listen, you're small people. All these other nations are much bigger, much mightier than you. Good for you, Jews. But Rabbi Joshua pushes it back on him, and he says, mighty is the shepherd who can save and protect the lamb and destroy the wolves surrounding her. Therefore it is written, Kol kli yutzar alayich lo yitzlach. There is every weapon created against you will not, any weapon that is created to wield against you will not succeed. So Rabbi Joshua, instead of accepting the praise as something kind of innately valuable about the Jews, says, no, actually the real focus needs to be on God. But I think, i.e. God is it that protects us against the wolves. But I think there's also something else that's going on here too. So the Midrash starts accepting the terms, right? That what we're talking about is the reversal of fortune, the reversal of power. Power is being wielded against us. We seize power and wield it against the ones who are trying to hurt us. Again, that's very moving, it's very cathartic, it's very powerful to think of it that way. But I think that Rabbi Joshua ends up actually both endorsing, but also in some way undercutting those terms. Because on one hand, he says, yeah, the shepherd is the one who schmeises out the wolves. It's not just resisting, it's actually that ultimately victory. But also, what's the real might of the shepherd? Gadol hu haro'eh shematzila v'shomra. The shepherd is great, not... The third thing in the list is that the shepherd destroys the predators. But the first two items that make the shepherd great are about saving and caring for the lamb. So God's might... while it's both endorsing or representing Jewish victory at the end of Megillat Esther, and then again that being used symbolically to also as a lens to read the oppression by the Roman Empire. But also in some ways it's undercutting this kind of power play, this dynamic of force and power, by saying that the true might is in God, not in politics, not in war. And the true might of God is actually primarily about care. And then it says, but to really care about protecting the rights and needs of this oppressed minority, there does need to be a real rebalance of power. There does need to be a real victory. There does need to be a real forceful protection. It's not enough just to say, to let the lamb figure out a way to wend its way through the predators. To let the predators remain means that the lamb is constantly under threat. So care involves removing of predators and predation. But the real power of God is not in the removal, but rather in the care that is the driving force that drives God's actions. Okay, so on one hand, again, it is saying the reversal, VeNahafoch, is about the change in power dynamics in which the lamb is able to overcome the wolves, fine. but also it's God that is the dynamic change in that. It's the catalyst of that change in dynamics. And God's real greatness is not in power per se, but in the power of care, or the care that moves God to intervene. The Malbim says, focusing on by this very day, right? It was on that day that the Persians were going to genocide us. And it was on that exact day that everything was reversed, right? That, like, again, putting your thumb on the scale, really focusing on that it was this day that something was supposed to happen, and the opposite happened. That this day was supposed to be the one when they were allowed to seize dominion over Israel, right? When the genocidal Hamanites, right? But now God made clear what the hand of providence can accomplish. So again, shifting. I mean, one of the things that this class is not about, but it's important to remember in the background. There's a whole zillion other classes you teach on this topic. But what's the only book of the Tanakh in which God's name is not mentioned once? Quick quiz. I'll give you a hint.
Esther.
I'm not trying to trick you. Yes, exactly. It's a book of Esther. God's name is not mentioned once. Now, the Zohar, the Midrash are very troubled by that. It's a famous line to say every time, just the phrase, when it says Hamelech Achashverosh, it refers to King Achashverosh. When it says Hamelech, the king, by itself, it's actually a secret way of referring to God. There's a lot of Kabbalistic and Hasidic Torah about the fact that Esther's name, Esther, is, it means she's hidden. Right? Because she's hiding. She's taking on another identity, a secret identity, and becoming queen of the Persians. But also then the mystics take that as a way of referring to God's own hidden qualities. That God is appearing in a hidden, esoteric way in this book. Not obviously. But similarly, right, it doesn't see, what causes the Jews' salvation at the end of the book of Esther? Seemingly, Esther's cleverness, Mordechai's courage, right? These are the things that cause Esther ends up basically doing entrapment against Haman and getting him to hang himself effectively, and then convincing Ahasuerus to give the Jews permission to fight back, which they didn't have. And it seems like it's just like a human victory. It doesn't have like the rabbinic revision of the story like in Hanukkah, right? In which, oh no, the real miracle is the oil, right? It's not just this military victory of the Maccabees, but the real victory, the real miracle happens, in the space of spirituality. Here, it really seems like, no, it's happening in a physical, political, military world, right? The Jews defeat an enemy that was poised against them to destroy the entire people. And thus, though, in a way, it motivates the mystics all the more so to see, like, no, what we're talking about is the deepest level of hiddenness. So here comes the Malbim, and the Malbim is saying the way to, it's a powerful lens in the sense of it's refusing to ever yield a space in which God's presence is not somehow there. But now God made clear what the hand of providence can accomplish. So it is God working through whatever's happening, right? That's what the Malbim's stressing. It says, for it was not only that the villains did not overpower them. So it's not just that we beat them. But rather, the matter was reversed. There's something special about the fact that everything was overturned. Completely overturned. Such that the aggressors were driven from their heights into the deepest pits, right? From the heights to the depths. And Israel ascended from Sheol, right, the pit of hell, to the zenith of victory. What he's focusing on here, in a way, is not just the quantity of the victory, the fact that it existed, the binomial nature of it, yes or no, victory or defeat, but the quality of it. That those who were so used to riding high on the hog, of living a life without any concern for others, wielding their power in a thoughtless and violent way, were brought low to see what it looks like to have that power wielded against them. And similarly, and conversely, Israel, who is so used to being powerless, to being threatened, such that their life was like being in hell. Right? That's what Sheol is, the pit of hell. They got to taste what it's like to feel secure, to feel safe, and not just that, but powerful. That's the quality that's what liberation looks like. That's what victory, redemptive victory looks like. I think we can use this to focus on the experience, the narrative of the Jews, and then think also of other liberation narratives, ones that I think being a Jew can help us be more sensitive to or be more aware of. What it looks like for a disempowered people, an oppressed people, to gain a sense of security and power that they didn't have before. Okay, that catharsis. Now moving to, I think, the last text I want to include as a kind of extended commentary on this reversal that reverses the positions but retains the binary. Right? There's the victor and the victim. There's the oppressor and the oppressed, the aggressor and the defender. Those positions stay true. It's just who occupies those positions change. But here's what the Rambam says. Again, all of these things both acknowledge it, but also in some way are playing with it, maybe sometimes undercutting it, like we saw before in the Tanchuma. It says, Kol sifrei hanavim v'chol ksuvim asidim libatel limos Mashiach. All of the books of the Tanakh, all of the prophetic books and all of the miscellaneous books at the end of the Tanakh, they will all be canceled. Cancel culture. It's real. They're all going to be canceled in the days of the Mashiach. Except, which one? Esther, except for Esther. I mean, think how crazy that is, right? Except for you think, maybe he means Shir Shirim, right? Because it's supposed to be the Kodesh Kodashim of the Torah, of the Tanakh, right? The Holy of Holies. Story of Israel and God's love story. Maybe it's, I don't know, Book of Isaiah, right? Or Ezekiel, these books of great prophetic visions. No, it's the one book in Tanakh without God's name. That's a bold one. So why, right? Except for Megillat Esther. Why? It says V'harehi kayemes kachamisha chumshei Torah, because it has the same sustainability as the 5 books of the Torah, which will not be negated. V'halachos shel Torah sheba'al peh, and it has the same permanence, the same substantiality as the halacha, right? which we learn from the oral tradition. She'enon b'teilin la'olam, right? Rambam is a legalist. The halacha will not, even when Mashiach comes, we're still going to have halacha. V'afal pichein, afal pi she'kol zichron tsurus yibatel, and he says, and even though, and this is a beautiful point, when Mashiach comes, and death will be swallowed, it says, right? Oppression will go away, and all mentioning of our suffering will also be negated. Right, what it means to have cosmic healing that Messiah brings is that you're no longer dwelling in the trauma. The troubles of the past are forgotten and hidden from my eyes. Right, these issues which keep us trapped in the sufferings of the past are resolved. Catharsis. It happens. Maybe this is what Mashiach is. Right? Mashiach is this limit that, what it means to be in the exile is that, we're always in some way dealing with this stuff that happens to us in our lives, stuff that happens to us as people. As I think any psychologist tell you, these things don't just go away. You don't forget them. But Mashiach is a radically different world in which that actually is possible. It's not this world, it's the next world. We're approaching this limit. It says, Yemei Purim, though, lo yibatzlu. But the days of Purim will not be negated, will not be canceled. As it says, V'imei Purim ha'ele lo ya'avru mitocha Yehudim v'zichrom lo yasuf mizaram. These days of Purim will never be repealed amongst the Jews, and the memory of them shall never cease from their descendants. Why? Isn't this baffling? Why isn't, the Havamina is, right, the challenging question is, why isn't this included as one of the mentionings of Tsuris? Isn't 8 chapters of the book, it's us being threatened with genocide? That's a bad one. Why? Because Esther, in the book of Esther, Megillat Esther, is truly a delivery of catharsis. It is the promise of victory. And that's why I think it really needs to really dig into the notion of, or into the dynamic of, it's not just that we withstood them. It's not just that we're the lamb that can survive amongst 70 wolves. It's that the wolves are destroyed, that predators are killed, that predation no longer exists because we gain the upper hand, we win. It's uncomfortable in a way because I think contemporary society doesn't like winning. I mean, I'll put it this way. Whoever, who likes winning? A certain distasteful person who was a head of state somewhat recently. Right? He doesn't like a bunch of losers, right? Like, you don't want to be a loser. You want to be a winner, right? Or like, it seems like Wall Street type thinking, right? Like, greed is good. You want to win. You got to wake up, grind. You have to have that right grind set. You got to just, grind away. You too can have a house. You too can pay no money rent on a house. All you have to do is buy a house and then rent out the house to other people, right? You too can have a house for free.
I don't think it's the distaste in winning or success. I think it's the oppressive side of like what had to be done in order to be claimed winners.
Right, but I mean, in a way, it forces us, I think, to confront that's something has to change. When something changes in which people have interests, people have certain investments. There's a phrase that's used in activist circles. Power yields nothing without demand. Right? Power doesn't yield anything on its own. So, again, you don't need to like buy totally into like, aha, they tried to genocide us, we genocided them. But rather what it is this is a vision of what it's like to no longer be scared, because now you won. You actually won. You have power now. It's, I think maybe distasteful, it's non-collaborative, right? This isn't like, we like found some kind of agreement at the end. No, this is that we won. And again, like you don't need to swallow it, but I want us to it's a provocation. I want us to experiment with the feeling of winning. Wouldn't that be interesting, right? So why is it that Esther is allowed to survive? Because Esther is a story of victory, ultimately. And it's one with catharsis. I think, in a way, what I really want us to experiment with is catharsis. Today, contemporary society has no catharsis in it, in our discourse. Things are never resolved. There's all, the internet remembers everything. We don't have any mechanism in which people can actually get past things, get through things together. We're being turned more and more into cops that are trying to catch each other and punish each other, snitch on each other. Catharsis, I think, in which you let something go, right? Like, I think we're both too scared to be the object of catharsis and too scared to be the subject of catharsis. We're scared to be yelled at, right? When, let's say, a friend is mad at us, and we're scared to do the yelling. Because there's a book by a very important culture writer, theater critic, and historian called Conflict is Not Abuse. Right? I think we conflate these two things. Purim shows us that conflict is necessary so that abuse, oppression, potential genocide is interrupted, right? Is ceased. So Purim gives us a taste of victory, of release, of catharsis. Okay, so again, what this is, this Nahafochu is one model of it. And I think, listen, I always defend everything. I always am trying to like kind of push to us to try to experiment with what it's like to feel this way, to think this way. But I also, I'm not actually saying, you need to agree necessarily, you need to swallow it. I just want us to acknowledge it. because we're also going to look at now a different model of that. I think so. We've looked at the way in which I think I can defend, or we can defend, this reversal, but the retention of the hierarchy, that we are now occupying the winning position, and the oppressed are the losers. But I think, as many people, as Susie in my dialogue showed, it was a Socratic dialogue, though, because Susie's point is incredibly valid, and I'm arguing against it to sharpen it, not to say that it's wrong. I think I'm right too, right? There's something to defend here, because I want us to, it's dialectical. I want us to try to experiment with this. I want us to taste it a little bit. But Susie's point, just using you as an example, or the point you were representing, but arguing quite well, is also true, right? Because I think we've seen Purim, unfortunately, become a flashpoint for Jewish chauvinism, for racism, for even sometimes violence, right? We're aware of the massacre that occurred in the 90s in Hebron, right? That occurred on Purim. There's a book by the late great historian Elliot Horowitz called Reckless Rights: Purim in the History of Jewish Violence. It's a really important and worthwhile book to read. Very sophisticated, very nuanced. So point is, though, is that it is important on Purim to taste power. It is important on Purim to feel powerful, to read the story of our victory. But on the other hand, there's always the risk of what it means to then swallow power, to absorb that power. And here comes the corrective. Because while the story of the Megillah is the story of our victory over the oppressors, what's the practice of Purim? The practice of Purim isn't that we go off and do our own pogrom, right? That's not the practice of Purim. The practice of Purim isn't we go find a bunch of anti-Semites and we beat the ever-living hell out of them. But I'm saying that's not Purim. What do we do on Purim? We have a carnival. We have a party. We're happy. We're not violent with our power, with our force. Our force and power comes out in joy. The celebration of life, of living, of winning. But not towards defeating, not towards violence, but rather towards the expansion of what it means to commit to the power of life itself. It's not aggressive. That's a good phrasing for it. It's not aggressive, but rather it's celebratory. So I want to be, so the practice of Purim actually ends up being an important corrective of sorts to where this could have gone. I think people didn't figure that out. There has been an increase in Jewish chauvinism, and I think we need to call that out. But that's, in my opinion, a bad reading of Purim. Purim gives us the space to experiment with the feeling of power. But then by feeling that powerful, it then gives us the practice of how to channel that power. And we channel that power into joy, not into aggression. There's something worth saying. There's a different class I teach about, actually, like the way it gives us a little bit of like a channel of what it means to cathartically release a little bit of like recklessness, but not in a way that is targeted violence, God forbid, but rather in a way in which we're able to kind of like, it's like a mosh pit. Purim's a mosh pit. Purim isn't a riot. Right? Those are two very different things. A mosh pit is a consensual group activity of safe violence, of safe catharsis, right? You throw your body into it. It's like it's a very ballistic kind of ballet, right? You're throwing your body into it with power and force, but in a way in which we're looking out for each other, not in a way in which you're trying to defeat each other. And you know the difference because if you've ever been in a mosh pit with a skinhead, Yimach Shmam, right? The Hamans of this world, you understand how little they understand what the mosh pit really is. The mosh pit is a group organism in which we're all taking care of each other aggressively.
Everyone catches you, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
And if you're short like me, they stand around you to make sure you don't get beat up too bad.
Exactly. So to repeat, just to clarify, right? The story of Jewish victory, which takes violence, don't get me wrong, and the story is a story of what it means to communicate power to us, to empower us on Purim. But we channel that power not into recapitulating the violent act, but rather we channel that power into the radical act of joy. And that's what we're going to see, a more far-reaching transformation than just the reversal of polarity. Now this is going to be a radical transformation, not just an overturning, but a transformation. Yeah, Shush.
But hold on a second. So that means that it's channeling joy over historical violence. So it's still being happy about violence.
We are happy about a victory, yes.
Even if violence was necessary,
I would say violence was necessary in that case, right? I mean, this is literally, like this is like the partisans resisting the Nazis, right? Except in this story, imagine the Holocaust, but the Holocaust didn't happen, and we beat all the Nazis, right? And that's what I'm saying. Like that's what Purim imagines. Purim imagines a different world in which we were able to win, fight the forces of oppression, and defeat them. But the true victory is not, as Rambam, I think, hinted, that's why I use that text as a transition. The true victory is not in dwelling in that, in that oppositional cycle, because then you're attached to the oppressor always. If winning to you is fighting, then you're always in some way losing. But real winning is what it means actually to channel that power into living, not into winning.
Right.
Would like labor movements be like maybe a good sort of comparison analogy? So like to have a 5-day work week or to have Medicare, have all these things, like massive labor strikes had to happen, or for the women to get the right to vote, like the women were beaten up and put in jail and went on starvation strikes and stuff. Like violence happened to gain things that really benefited society in the end.
Yeah,
and we
but
celebrate the results, right? Like,
but the example of like women, like that would have been more in my mind, like women going and like being really violent together against men, not inflicting self-starvation or
well, I mean,
protesting in that way.
I mean,
As far as I know, we haven't done that. Let me know when we do.
I mean, most protests have had an aspect of violence. It's usually more property damage than people damage, but
okay.
Yes, I think the it may be like that sound the machlekes between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, right? Whether nonviolence is a working strategy for activism, or whether like Malcolm X wanted like say no, like this is a war we're in. I think one of the things that I come to realize, I think is hopefully especially over the last bunch of years, watching state violence unfold, right? Like the instruments of violence that the state uses, police, right, things like that, is that there is a certain amount of force and violence used to maintain the status quo. And I think a lot when things become out of control, it's when that violence is turned back on the people who are using it, right? That's like going too far, seemingly. So I think like what I'm trying to push us to do is in a way confront that scandalous feeling, right? I think the scandal is felt when like, oh, we wish things could have been resolved peacefully. But to think that means to erase the way in which like it already wasn't peaceful. So Purim is a radical experimentation, a mental experiment of our imagination. Imagine the Holocaust, but the partisans won. There was no, the death camps were destroyed. The Nazis thrown into the ovens. I'm using provocative language because that's really what it is, right? The oppressors were destroyed. But here comes the second step. We can always stay in that victim mentality of needing to beat the oppressors, needing to beat the seeming victors. But that keeps us tied to the oppressors always, because we're always in that dialectic of having to resist them. The more far-reaching VeNahafoch transformation is actually changing the very terms that we're talking about. All right, so the first model of VeNahafoch is the reversal of the polarity, but the retention of the hierarchy. The victims become the victors, but still, they're in the same struggle. It's just that now we won. But if we're always stuck in that, we're always stuck in that place of struggle and of pain, I would say, that place of trauma that Rambam was talking about. But Purim imagines something farther, because Megillat Esther, we keep it even in the days of the Mashiach, which means that there's something messianic about Megillat Esther, something that is past this dialectic of struggle, to change the very terms of the situation. So let's look at that version. It says, Mordechai recorded these events, right? That's why actually, I don't know if you've seen this, but when you unroll the book of Esther, the Megillah of Esther, it has to be a Megillah because it's a letter. Letters were written on scrolls, and you unfold it in a way, the way that letters were written. So you fold it, and it's not like you unroll it like a Torah scroll with two rolls, but rather you unfold it and you fold it and fold it under it. That's actually how you're supposed to hold a Megillah, because it's supposed to be held like a letter. It's very important that happens. So keep an eye out for your Megillah readers. Mordechai recorded all these events, and he sent dispatches to all the Yehudim throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus, near and far, charging them, challenging them, right? Commanding them to observe the 14th and 15th days of Adar every year, Purim. The same days on which the Jews enjoyed relief from their foes, in the same month, which had been transformed for them from one of grief and mourning to one of festive joy. Aho! So the transformation here now is not about victim and victor, oppressor and oppressed. Now it's about the complete change of the Lebenswelt, the living world, the life experience of the Jew. That's what's being radically transformed. And that is not locked in a dialectical struggle. That is what it means to experience life differently. That's what's been transformed. Right? It's relief from the foes. Catharsis, stage one. And then the real transformation is the day that we were a day of fear becomes a day of joy. That's healing. All right? When you're not looking over your shoulder, you're not worried, your heart's not beating fast, you're able to sink into life and enjoy it. They were to observe them as days of feasting and merrymaking, and as an occasion for sending gifts to one another and presents to the poor. That's Purim. How do we channel what it means to have freedom, what it means to have power, what it means to have relief and release? Victory, what does victory look like to the Jewish soul? It's not defeating the enemies. It's not beating up the anti-Semites every Purim. It's loving people. It's taking care of the poor. It's being the shepherd, not the terrorist sheep. Not the freedom fighter sheep, right? It's being the shepherd, learning to model real power, which is not about violence, but is about care. How do we channel our freedom and power into Purim? We look to those who need the help the most, and we provide for them care. That's power. That's victory. That's what it means to win. That's the radical transformation. It takes you out of the dialectic of defeat versus victory, of oppressed versus oppressor, and it brings us into what it means to have actual freedom, no longer locked in struggle, and what it means to truly practice living and loving life, to bring more life to others, to bring joy others, sustenance to others. That's the transformation. That's the far-reaching VeNahafoch. And how do we know that? Nehapach, the same exact verb. That's not an accident. And I think they come in sequence on purpose. Forgive me, Rashi, who says, Ein mukdam meuchar b'Torah. Rashi says things don't have to be in a specific order than Torah. Ramban disagrees. I'm going with the Ramban here. It isn't an order. The order is important. The first stage is necessary to taste the catharsis of victory, the force and the power of what that feels like, to win. But the second stage is what we need to channel it into, that you're not stuck in what it means to be always having to defeat so that you feel powerful. Rather, to internalize the freedom and to really believe the release. Catharsis releases you from the struggle, from the cycle. Right? The struggle now becomes, how do I find the most number of people who need money that I can give them money? How do I find the most number of people I can cram into my apartment so we can have a party? How do I find the biggest bag of paper bags so I can give people bags of cookies? Right? That's the struggle on Purim. How can I bring people the most joy, the most carbs? Right? That's the challenge of Purim. Then the Jews received what they had been made to do, like the obligation, the hechilu, right? Everything that Mordechai wrote for them. Back to the Malbim. Malbim has something very different to say now. He says, the same days in which the Jews were relieved. That is, each person is to celebrate Purim on the 14th or the 15th, regular Purim, Shushan Purim. But we also must explain why God commanded us to make a feast and give gifts. Right? Why? Again, the Havamina, I want to ask, like, why isn't Purim like, yeah, you go off and you do a chaptzim. You go and grab a bunch of people and beat the ever-living snot out of them. Like, why isn't that Purim? Why isn't it Pogrom Day? Right? The answer is, no, it is. People think it is. It's not. Why is it that we are channeling this power into feasting, into joy-making? The answer is the same month which had been transformed. For two elements transformed during this month. One, grief became joy. It's what it means to live, how it feels to live. That's the real transformation. That we're able to have healing. The grief, the anticipation, the anxiety, that's transformed into joy. And two, mourning became a festival. Opposite the joy, i.e. like vis-a-vis the joy, we make a feast and celebrate. Right? You make a party. You groove it. You groove down. You boogie down. And opposite the festival, since Mordechai was not actually allowed to make another yontif, not allowed to make it, Torah's closed. You can't make another holiday, like a yontif holiday where you have to can't go to work, etc. Instead, he established a day on which one is to give gifts to the poor. Very interesting, because you're not allowed to give tzedakah on Shabbos. You're not allowed to give tzedakah on Yontif. Right? It's weird. Like, I think a lot of people who are like new to Shabbos and Yontif are like, listen, I'm going to use this day as like a day to volunteer. I'm going to use this day to like do something good. Shabbos and Yontif actually aren't about doing things. It's actually a more radical vision of the world than that. But Purim is a day. How do you celebrate Purim? The real way you celebrate Purim is you give. You give to the poor. You bring life and enjoyment. You guarantee it to make sure everyone can feel powerful this day, even those who are still beaten down. How do we win on Purim? We pick up the charge to help the oppressed. We give gifts to the poor. Because the real purpose of the Yontif is to separate from the trivialities of this world. That's what Yontif is supposed to do. And focus instead on serving God and the Torah. Thus, Mordechai issued a command reflecting this, that one should give tzedakah. The essence of Purim is tzedakah. It's gifts to the poor. So that, I think, is a really important... I wonder if it's a subtle point, I think, that's being made, but it's a really powerful one. It's that the real... most far-reaching, most radical transformation is not that we won when we almost lost, but rather that it resolves what it means to be in that dialectic, that struggle of always almost losing. What do they say about Jewish holidays? What's that really hack joke?
We were oppressed. God freed us. We eat.
Yeah, exactly. They tried to kill us. They didn't. Let's eat. I've hated that joke forever. And the reason is because it is such a paltry way of understanding what joy is supposed to look like. Because it always confines joy to a narrow victory, a narrow escape. Purim is the most like that joke of all the holidays we have. Like Purim, Hanukkah too, but Purim most of all. But Purim is the one that resists that joke the most. Because it's not, they tried to kill us, they didn't, let's eat. It's they tried to kill us, they didn't, we healed. Let's make sure others can eat. Rambam says if you celebrate Yontif, a holiday of some kind, and this is like a Yontif, says the Malbim, by just feeding yourself, then the joy you have is the joy of your tummy. But to make sure that others can eat, that's the joy of the mitzvah. That's what it means to have a radically transformed world. Not just a radically transformed position in a society that stays the same. A radically transformed life. That's Purim. It's a different way of living. So how is that practiced? Well, here comes an interesting thing. So I want to use this example of cross-dressing. So I want to also, in a way, do what Edmund Husserl, the phenomenologist, called an epoche. I want to bracket off this topic and just use it for what's called a heuristic example. So the pasuk in Deuteronomy 22:5 says that a woman shouldn't wear men's clothing and a man shouldn't wear women's clothing because those who do these things is abhorrent to God, toeva. And the word toeva is often used when it comes to reversing or playing with these boundaries, with these binaries, right? Leviticus and Deuteronomy have a lot of wanting to categorize things, to keep things in their proper place. Now, I want to be very careful when I say this because this kind of language is used a lot actually in contemporary, let's say, panics about bathrooms and schools and things like that, sports teams. But I want to be very careful when I say this. Rashi understands this. It says, Lo asr Torah el levusha mevi lidei toeva. The reason that this is, he has it's called this Tama mitzvah. He's giving a motivating purpose to this. So the reason for this Isser, for Torah forbidding this, is that this kind of clothing practice, wearing opposite clothing, brings you to some kind of toeva. And he's citing the Sifrei, which is a rabbinic midrash. And what's the toeva? Here, the toeva seems to be some kind of infidelity, some kind of cheating, or maybe even we could say, in the case of, let's say, somebody trying to gain access to maybe a space that they're not intended to have access to, potentially violence. Okay, so in this case, again, I want to bracket, contemporary cross, I'm trying not to, I'm just using this as an example. The example is that says Torah forbids men wearing women's clothing, women wearing men's clothing. Why? Because it brings, says Rashi, it says the Sifrei, to a place of potential violence or gaining some kind of personal advantage, some kind of taking liberties, right? It's a subtly violent act, whether it's literally trying to hurt somebody else or doing something hurtful. Okay? Here comes the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch says, Ma shenagu lilvosh partsufim befurim. There's this custom that we have of wearing masks on Purim. Right, so imagine, Purim is literally a carnival-esque holiday. Imagine, Lahavdil Elf of Dulles, Mardi Gras. Okay, you wear these masks, you go to a party, etc. Okay. But interesting, this is the only classical source we have that says that you wear masks on Purim. It's only in the Ramah on the Shulchan Aruch. So it's in the Ashkenazi gloss on the Purim, on the law code. It says V'gever lovesh simlas isha v'isha kli gever. And what else happens on Purim? And a man wears women's clothing, and a woman can wear man's clothing. Even though, just on the face of it, that exact act is forbidden by the Torah. Now, I want to be clear. It's very interesting. I cut this out, but in the end of this section, he says, also, you're allowed to wear what is called kilayim derabanan. You can wear a mixture of wool and hemp. Not literally wool and linen, which is the one that the Torah says you can't do, but the one that the rabbis say, it's too close. You shouldn't wear wool and hemp or other things like that. He says you can violate that minor rabbinic rule. But here he literally says you can violate a biblical rule on Purim. There's a lot to say again about the Mardi Gras, carnivalesque, subversion on Purim, domesticated sinning on Purim, all of these other things we can go into what a reversed, overturned, revolved, revolutionized world means, a transformed world means. We're not going to go all the way there. That's a different class. But here I just want to say, above it says, Torah says, cannot cross-dress. Why? Because it can potentially give you access to a space in which you could do something that can hurt others. It says the rabbinic reading of that. Comes the Ramah and says, you know what, though, on Purim you can. Men can wear women's clothing, women can wear men's clothing. Why? Ein iser b'davar. He says it's not forbidden. Why? Me'achar she'ein mechavnin ela l'simcha be'alma. Because it is clear what the purpose is on Purim. It is only for the sake of joy. Now, there's interesting readings in terms of that. In terms of, okay, so wearing reversed clothing as an expression of oneself, a joyous expression of oneself, has at least some room to work in Jewish tradition. That's Purim-dic clothing, Purim-dic living. Living life in a celebratory, expressive, free kind of way. I think that's an interesting kind of ground you can situate yourself in terms of thinking about this clothing question. But again, I'm going to leave that kind of just there as an open point. But to the point of Purim, you are not allowed, of course, to ever do anything to substantively, in a way that really, you can never hurt somebody. You're never allowed to hurt somebody. That is clear. You are allowed to, though, take this potentially radical practice of changing up your clothing, and maybe we can, as a way of expressing yourself and finding joy. So we have this root of a practice on Purim of transforming yourself, dabbling with the opposite, exploring the other side, wearing the other gender's clothing, wearing a mask so you look like and seem like someone else, your alter ego, your doppelganger, your secret self. Right? This is the way in which hiding, Esther, hiding yourself, gives you access to something truer. What if transformation is not just something that we're talking about theoretically, but Purim empowers us to transform ourselves, to find something truer than what appears normally. So transformation as a practice of self to access simcha ba'alma, which means kind of just joy. But I would actually say the world's joy, the joy of living in your world. That's what Purim is promoting. There's a lot of Hasidic Torah about this radical transformational principle. I think maybe too much to go into in this one class, but again, I'll share the source sheet. There's 3 texts, but I think the one I might want to look at here is a comment on this famous Gemara, and with this we'll close. There's always too many texts. It should always be too much. So Megillah 7b, we know this one, right? It's famous, right? Amar Rava mechayevini shlabasumi l'puraya ad lo yada. Ad lo yada. Ben Arur Haman levarach Mordechai. Now, if you remember last year, I showed us how Arur Haman and Baruch Mordechai have the exact same gematria. So maybe there is no difference. Right. Okay. But the point is, Rava says every person is obligated to become so drunk on Purim that you cannot tell the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Now I want to be very clear. The question about what that drinking means, the Tosfos actually say that doesn't mean getting totally schlammered. Tosfos actually says it actually means getting kind of woozy, kind of buzzy, so that things start to maybe seem less distinct than they were. As she said, it doesn't mean to get so drunk you pass out and puke all over yourself. This text is often used to justify confusing the means for the end. The point is not to get so drunk, but rather to get yourself in a state in which you can't tell the difference between things that you thought were radically different, things that you thought were good and things that you thought were bad. Purim is about exploring something that is more unifying than that. Remember I said before, The first model of VeNahafoch is one that keeps Haman cursed and keeps Mordechai blessed. We won, they lost. So yeah. But the more far-reaching VeNahafoch, VeNapachadavar, in the second section of the text we looked at, is one actually that is about finding something about the unifying nature of life that's able to absorb and to integrate everything into it, to channel force and violence into the power of love and generosity. That's one, then, it's a kind of charitable living. Right? And the word charity it comes from the Greek word for grace, charitas. It's a way of living graciously and gracefully and generously in the world. Yeah, no, that's right. That's quite right. We do get to, as Susie just said, we get to the place, say like, just like you start to love strangers, right? You find something real in that, right? It's not love as some kind of exchange between people. It's love as an orientation of living. It's a recognition of commonly living. It's love that undergirds life. As Rambam says in the Guide Perplexed, the world doesn't exist for a reason. I'm paraphrasing. There's no reason the world exists. The world exists because God wanted to create it. It is a gift that God gave us that there is a world. It is an act of love. It's an act of giving. It's a generous act. Purim, we recapitulate that generosity. That love that's at the heart of what it means to be alive. That's the victory of Purim. So, you are obligated to become so fragrant, to have an altered state of consciousness. And however you reach that, that's great. That's fine. Again, you do not need to drink on Purim. You can do whatever you need to do to reach that state legally. It might involve drinking. It might involve involving other substances. It might just involve dancing until you just bliss out. Right, whatever it is, but that's that's your practice on Purim. That's what you need to do. Use whatever you need to use to get to a state in which you are reaching a state of universal love. Okay, so here comes a teaching of Chaim V'Chesed, which is from Chaim Chaikel of Amdur, a infrequently taught early Hasidic master, but a radical spiritualist, finding kind of this, one of the more radical mystics of the early Hasidic movement. Here's what he says. He says, when it says the person's obligated to become so fragrant on Purim that you don't know the difference, he says, Perush, sheyagbia es atzmei lemakom she'ein sham hischalkus. What does that mean? It means you elevate yourself to a level, to like a way of living, a way of consciousness in which there is no differentiation at all. And that's nothing, right? But the mystical nothing, the infinite source of all. Purim is the highest holiday, right? The one that is kept even when Mashiach comes, because we actually reach the source of existence beyond duality. It says, because in the Madrega Tachtona, in the lower level, we still see a difference between chesed and gevura, between love and law, between kindness and judgment. Right? We see a difference between the way the qualities between things. Some things are good, some things are bad. Some things are nice, some things are nasty. That's what it means to live in this world. V'hinei machmas sheYisrael pagmu behadas. But because we, in the Garden of Eden, damaged das, the source of knowledge, right, the tree of knowledge, by taking the fruit. Al-Kain ba lehem Amalek. That's what caused Amalek. Us taking the fruit in the Garden of Eden is Amalek, is what he's saying. Why? Because Amalek wanted to separate us from knowledge of God, from our consciousness being in touch with God. And Haman is a descendant of the lineage of Amalek. And he also wanted to divide us, separate us, deter us from knowing, from contact with God. V'al yidei tzadik, and by means of the righteous, Mordechai, Esther, etc. Shehu mare dechaya, master of merit. Nimtaku ha'gevuros, the gevura, the judgment, was sweetened, i.e., one was made the other. Chesed was able to integrate gevura. Shechazak hadas, that consciousness, knowledge of God became strong. And that's why we read the Megillah, which involves the sweetening of the judgments, i.e., the victory over Haman and his murderous cronies is not about using gevura to defeat them, power and force, but it's about ultimately the victory of love, as we're able to find and integrate it into ourselves, what's occurring. Look at this last text from the VeNahafoch, from the I think the first Sudelikover Rebbe from the late 18th, early 19th century. He says, the reason for getting so drunk on Purim is lafisha tzarich l'hamshich chiyus shenikra baruch. Why? Because we actually need to bring vitality, i.e., divine flow, divinity. Right? The world is like, this big system of plumbing. We've talked about this a lot. And we need to bring down God's flow. Right? There's actually, Renee had a beautiful discussion of this in her session about challah making for Adar. We're just wrapping up, Renee. We need to bring down divine energy, divine flow, which is called Baruch, blessed, but meaning blessing, right? But Baruch Mordechai. Bring the Baruch even to the spark that's trapped in the shell. Purim is about realizing that things aren't just what they appear. If you were just to look at as things appear, you'd say, oh, that's a shell. And you'd forget that there's a fruit inside of it. Oh, that's something bad. And you wouldn't dig deeper to find something good that's inside of it. So there's a spark of God's trapped inside of this shell. And the key of Purim is drawing down the energy so that it even gets there too. He says that's not what, God forbid, it's not to say Arur Haman bechavana. No, if we were to buy into the terms of the debate, to buy and say, you know how we beat Haman? He's cursed. He's bad. I hate him. That lets Haman win. Because we stay attached to Haman in that kind of way. We need to keep on defeating him. The way to really defeat Haman, right? If we were to buy into what it means to always have to beat him, win, defeat him, then in that case, we're actually drawing down energy, momentum, power to the other side. Because we're infusing it with our attention, with our obsession, with our inability to disconnect. Rak shebehiyosa lo yada ben arur Haman levarach Mordechai. Only when we're able to get past knowing the difference between those two. Azai nimshach habaruch lisham below kavana. Then, without buying in, we're then able to bring the love and bring God everywhere without playing into the terms of the binary, of the violence, of the victory. Such that we're able then to access the spark of the divine inside of what this strife and struggle was. It's the energetic dynamic here, says the VeNahafoch, is that the way to defeat Haman is to play a different game, to bring love, metaphysically, to bring life to exactly where they want you to not, to where they want you to bring death. To refuse to play the game that they want you to play, the game of winning and losing, the game of victim and victor. The way you truly win is to be free. Catharsis is the route to true victory, not to defeat or to subjugate. The way we're able to be truly victorious on Purim is by learning actually how to get beyond those forces of division and difference and instead access something greater. Shosh, I saw your question. I think what's missing there is that we've gone through a progression, right? Like we started with a first stage, and then we've moved to a different stage. The first stage is that there is a real historical, pragmatic thing occurring, right, in which there are real forces of violence being of the oppressor against the oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
And for there to be a chance of a more equitable and just society, that violence needs to be opposed, right? That the oppressed pick up arms and defend themselves against the oppressors. The second question is, what's the true victory then? Is it then to become the oppressors yourself? To always be winning through military might? No, the more far-reaching transformation, the real nature of Purim, because if that were the case, right, Purim would be a holiday of violence, in which what we're asked to do is to go around and to do like a passion play, right? Like on Christmas, no, the passion play, it's a play of violence, right? It is, the Jews kill Christ. But Purim, the true essence of Purim, and Rambam is very explicit, the halacha is very explicit. The true essence of Purim is not in restaging scenes of violence, but rather in recommitting yourself to acts of love and generosity. That's what it means to win, to take your power and then turn it towards the forces of good, and I would say of love, and that then is captured by this more far-reaching transformation of what it means to then live in a different kind of way, in which your fear and your anxiety are transformed into joy. Your mourning is transformed into a celebration. Because if we were stuck in the struggle, in the fight all the time, then you would still have strife. You would still have anxiety. You would still have mourning. The true victory is what it means to move past, to imagine and to practice a more revolutionarily transformed world. So when we practice that by the practices of Purim, right? The true aspect of Judaism, which I think is missed by people who just like to say have a dabbling interest in things. The true aspect of all Jewish things are not just in theory, reading, texts, it's in practice. Judaism is a religion of living. Their text is our lives. That's Torah. We actualize Torah in this world. There's a lot to be said about that. If you want to get deep into it, you want to learn Hemshech Samech Vav by the 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe. It'll tell you all about that. That doing the mitzvah is actually the way to access the true aspect of divinity. But the point of that is that living is the true is how Purim is truly lived, is truly actualized. It's if we were stuck in just reading the story over and over, then we make the mistakes that I think many Jews have made. That Purim is a restaging of a scene of violence. And that's what victory looks like. But the true victory of Purim is to transform ourselves, to do whatever we need to do to find a new and different way of living, to access a love that undergirds the things that we thought were different, to find a universal generosity, to bring joy and healing and sustenance to those who need it most, to channel our power not into winning, but rather into living, not into victimizing, God forbid, but the true victory is found in virtue. It's found in loving and living better to bring the true joy of Purim to everyone you can find. And I hope for us that we can struggle with this. I think the key, and shows your question is a very important one, because what I'm trying to address in this class, and I never like to ignore things, but rather I want to respond to something. Like Purim has become and can be seen as, let's say, a simple reductive story of Jewish chauvinistic victory, right? Jews win, Goyim lose, take that. But I think that is a poor reading of the fullness of Purim, because it misses that Purim is lived in a way that it's already in Megillat Esther. Mordechai commands us not to restage the battle every year, but to throw a party that focuses on benefiting and giving to those who need the most. That's what it means to have power, to be kind and to be generous without constraint. And as Rambam says, you've really reached the level of Purim, of not knowing the difference between Haman and Mordechai. When any single person who reaches out their hand to you, who needs, you just give. You don't do an assessment of whether they deserve it or not. You don't go, oh, I wonder if they're going to spend it on drugs. You don't judge them, you just love them. And that involves a certain kind of practice of trust. So that's the challenge of Purim. It's to struggle not with the other, but with ourselves. To break down the walls that we have inside of us that keep us from loving each other. That's the radical potential victory and the messianic nature of Purim. Gefach. Shkayach, shkayach. Thanks for that push at the end, Shosha. It helped, I think, clarify Crystal.
Thanks, Josh. No, that was great. Thank you.
Purim, it's happening. Wednesday night, 7:30 at Beth Leda. Thursday morning, 7:30 in the morning at Beth Leda. Wednesday night, we'll be hanging out afterwards outside. We'll light a fire. We'll drink some brewskis. We'll make some hot dogs, etc. Marshmallows. And then Thursday morning, there'll be like a small, after davening, for those who can stick around, we'll have like a small Suda downstairs. Brunchy foods. It'll be delicious. And then no Parsha chat this week because it's Purim. I will not be in a state in which I will be able to responsibly give a class. And then here comes hungover Shabbos. And I'll see you all at Shul. All right. Good luck, everybody.
Wait, just one other tiny, because I missed it in the text. Sorry, the whole Holocaust comparison, was that yours or was that in the text and I just missed it?
Oh no, that's very much mine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Okay.
I mean, interesting, and I want to say, like, provocative, right? It's like, obviously, it's a very sensitive question, like, but I'm saying,
yeah,
like,
Purim, I was trying to follow along, and I'm like, I didn't see that in the commentary.
But that's the premise of Purim, right? Purim is that we were threatened with genocide and we won. It's not that we, like, survived, right? We didn't win the Holocaust. Like, yes, the Allies won World War II, but we did not.
No, I get it. Yeah.
What if we won the Holocaust, right?
I
Like
could see it.
that's the premise of Purim.
Okay, interesting.
Okay.
Okay, bye everyone. Thank you.
All right, see y'all. Good luck.